the technological developments, the key systems they're developing in terms of launch, in terms of on-orbit operations, deep space, communications, data links, and so forth, all contribute to a broader goal of China as a spacefaring civilization that can fully utilize resources and positioning within space to its advantage.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. In this episode, we're talking about China, space, technology, and defense since the beginning of the year. And there have been a number of major space-related developments. And I'm lucky to have with me two internationally recognized China experts. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst with the Defense Strategy Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Brendan Mulvaney, director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute at Air University. Hello, gents.
Hi, Laura. How are you?
It's great to see you, and I love that shirt, Brendan.
Thanks. It's actually an official Cassie shirt that we get to wear around the office.
And Brendan, you told me that you are in Newport, Rhode Island. That would make me think that you are visiting the Naval War College. Am I right?
Yep, that is correct. We're actually up here teaching our 3-day People's Liberation Army Fundamentals course in conjunction with we like to call them our Big Brother Institute, the China Maritime Studies Institute, CMSI, up here in Newport.
That's really cute, Big Brother and all. And Malcolm, you are coming to us from Canberra, Australia. When are you coming to visit us?
Look, I would love to have teleportation and just beam straight over there now, but unfortunately, we're about 200 years too soon for that technology. So I think probably, hopefully next year, I will get over there. I missed out this year, but unfortunately, it'll have to be next year before I can get over to visit with DC.
Well, thank you both for coming on the line for this discussion. Now, if you're watching this on the live stream, come and find the downlink on your YouTube or Apple Podcasts, channel network, and hit subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. It only takes a second, and it really helps others find the show. Now, I've organized this discussion on the first half of this year in parts. And the first topic that I think we should tackle are the technological feats, which we know have been supported by, if not outright managed by, China's People's Liberation Army. So right off the bat, I want to tackle China's reusable rocket. It's called the Long March 10B. It's shorter, it's fatter, and its liftoff mass is heavier than the SpaceX Falcon 9. But the metric that really counts is payload mass. It can carry 16,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, but that's roughly 2.5 metric tons less than the Falcon 9. It is reusable, and it successfully launched and landed a few weeks ago on July 10th. So, Malcolm, just how big of a deal is this?
Look, it's a big advance for the Chinese space program in the sense that they are making progress on reusable rockets. It brings China up to the level of where SpaceX was some years back with Falcon 9. I have to say the recovery method is a little bit more cruder than SpaceX with Falcon 9. All those
Do you want to explain what that is? Yeah, because
sure.
It's a funky picture.
For those who've seen it on social media, the booster comes back and lands in a net, basically, of cables that are suspended over the landing ship by a structure of pylons. And the net catches the booster. Where if you look at the SpaceX model, yes, they've had a few botched landing attempts, but there you have the booster just landing on the ship without anything else. And so the actual approach to recovering that booster is probably a little bit cruder in that sense, but I'm not sure that's a significant thing if what they're trying to achieve is to effectively match Falcon 9. I think the big step forward is not necessarily this. The big step forward is if the Chinese can develop some sort of means to match Starship. That's some way off. But I think that this at least is a step forward for them. It gives them an ability probably to be competitive with SpaceX if they can get their launch costs down. And I think that that's what they're aiming for. This is about the commercial market more so than anything else. It's about China probably being the lead launch partner for the global south and having some degree of reusability is probably an important step forward for them.
Brendan, what do you think?
So I would take a slightly different view. I don't know that it's sure getting the most payload to launch is absolutely an important commercial asset, but it's really how quickly can you reuse it? How many times can you reuse it? How much fuel do you have to retain to come back down? So it's really this is a great demonstration of the technology, but they're nowhere near where SpaceX is today. Certainly several years ago, sure you can make that comparison, but it's not how much can you get there. It's how quickly can you get multiple times there. How many times can you use that rocket? What do you have to discard? And how long can you get it back into the cadence? And that's this is the one-off. You can't really criticize it for yet, but they've got a ways to go.
And Brendan, there have been more developments. There's the Tianwen-2 asteroid mission, which reached its target destination in early July, and the Chinese Academy of Science and a group of other Chinese academic institutions has made significant progress with laser communications. Perhaps those two are the really big things, or maybe there's something else, Brendan. What do you think has been another significant technological advancement that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think this is a really big legitimate science mission that they accomplished, right? And it was something.
You're talking about the Tianwen, though,
Sorry,
right?
yes,
Or
yes, the TN1, yeah, and that demonstrated their ability to find something in space, right? You can't use GPS. There's no maps, so they've got to be able to track it. They've got to be able to get to it, do a remote proximity operation close to it, close enough to get the samples. And so I think all of those things, including, like you said, the laser comms, including this. A semi-autonomous or completely autonomous because it was so far away, the lag, it had to do a lot of these things on its own. So this is a pretty big scientific, I'll call it robotic or autonomous or semi-autonomous scientific project that they actually did. And of course, it's going to come back, drop those things off, and then go back out. So I think that just shows that it's not all. Sometimes it is just about science and proving the technologies and driving things forward.
and what about you, Malcolm? Is there another technological development that you think that we should be paying attention to?
Look, I think the fact that what Brendan's talking about there with that mission to that asteroid and the laser comms, I think we need to see it in the bigger astrostrategic picture in terms of China's perception of how they use space as a nation. It's about how they establish an ecosystem or the infrastructure to enable them to operate expansively across space, to do complex operations. It's very different from the approach that the US took at the beginning of the space age, which was a sequential step-by-step process. With the Chinese, what they're trying to do is establish the foundations for a space-based society or a space-based economy that enables them to do a lot of things simultaneously. So go to the moon, have low Earth orbit space stations, rendezvous with asteroids, all the things that you need to be able to do that on an ongoing basis. It's a much more ambitious approach to space than how the US started, but of course it was a different age back then for the US. But it's interesting when you look at the US now and you look at what China's doing now, the US with Artemis is still very much a sequential process. It's understandable because that's how they've gotten used to doing things. The Chinese are taking a fundamentally different path in that regard. And that's an interesting observation in itself, in the sense that the technological developments, the key systems they're developing in terms of launch, in terms of on-orbit operations, deep space, communications, data links, and so forth, all contribute to a broader goal of China as a spacefaring civilization that can fully utilize resources and positioning within space to its advantage.
A systems of systems type of concept. Yeah, as opposed to start, stop, go that we do here. Not just here in the United States, but I would say, East is probably guilty of the same thing, to be honest. I hate to say it, but really. But hey, so now that China, really is a major spacefaring nation and therefore has the technology, it can export the fruits of their labor, right? For profit in guanxi, which is pull or influence. There's nothing new in that, though, right? Other spacefaring nations do the same, including the United States. But China has been helping Iran with space assets quite a bit. That and help from Russia has likely ended in the death of U.S. service members in the Middle East. Could you guys explain what's the state of play here? Brendan, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Chinese have definitely built a huge space architecture here. One of their driving goals was to get away from GPS reliance, because at the end of the day, it was Uncle Sam had the finger on the trigger on that one. And although we've been benevolent enough, if you want to think about it that way, to let the rest of the world use it, we could turn it on and off. We can change the encoding so that the signal that most people get wasn't going to be as accurate, right? And so the Chinese like, no, that is not acceptable to us. And so they created the Beidou constellation. Took them a long time to get it, but it is up and running. It is, I would say, comparable in almost every metric to the GPS, right? And so part of the Belt and Road Initiative, part of their going out, part of their diplomatic was to spread Beidou receivers across the world wherever they went. That includes Iran. So they have Beidou receivers there. They have incorporated them into military hardware, and that's both platforms and weapons. And so certainly they are able to use it just like anyone around the world that has a UAV that has a GPS receiver can use it, right? And so that's not necessarily nefarious or China actively helping them, right? It's that following step that has been reported on and off. Are they getting better Beidou signals? And really, it's not even the signals; it's how are they processing them in order to make an active military target, right? It's that closing that loop with the find, fix, target, engage, right? All the things that you have to do in a military sense. And that's where we simply don't know in the publicly available sphere how much, if at all, China is actively assisting the Iranians, as opposed to them just using advanced Chinese technology that isn't GPS in order to drive their own weapons. That's kind of the gray area, if you will, at the moment.
To me if I'm wrong, guys. I have read reports that Chinese companies have sold, and I mean sold, satellites to Iran, that the Chinese, have helped them operate them for Earth observation and possibly
So,
for
yep.
communication. So I'm not very sure about that. And that's a big deal because that means the Chinese government would sign off on saying, right, well, we're going to let Iran use this technology, and Iran would use this technology to target our folks that are in the region, right? I mean, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, essentially, what you have is the Chinese providing advanced positioning, navigation, and timing support to the Iranian military to enable them not only to do, precision navigation and targeting, but also the timing signals that are coming out of Beidou. It's in the same way that GPS timing signals are critical for advanced command and control. So it elevates Iran's military capabilities indirectly by allowing the Iranians to access Beidou potentially at a higher level than the typical commercial use of Beidou to deliver military effects against the US that then lead to ultimately US casualties. So I do think that this is a significant step on the part of China. I do think it indicates that China is definitely involved in supporting Iran in undertaking military operations against the US in the same way that Russia is. And I think that we need to take that very seriously. And it's a significant escalatory step or provocative step on the part of Beijing to do this to support Iran actively in this regard.
Well,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think
because
we actually profiled one of the companies that you were talking about, Chongguang. We put a profile up on the website, the Cassie website. I think it was April of 24 ish. So this is a known bad actor. It's been sanctioned and continues to do things around the world that are counter to American interests, and obviously putting U.S. servicemen and assets at risk.
and it's also not just Zhangguang. There's Earth Eye Company, right? They have both of them recently, probably sanctioned again, but they were recently in May sanctioned for their role in Iran's military satellite acquisitions. And that, I mean, acquisitions, not just pictures, but acquisitions of hardware that is in orbit. But the question I have for you guys is, will sanctions really work?
No, is the short answer. It's sanctions are something that you do when you want to feel like you're doing something, but you're not actually doing anything really. Yes, we've looked at. Look at Russia, Ukraine. We've sanctioned Russia, and it has achieved absolutely nothing in stopping that war or convincing Putin to back down and seek a negotiated settlement. I think the same can be said here. Putting sanctions on Iranian companies or putting sanctions on Chinese companies ultimately is going to achieve nothing in this regard.
And
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of utility to sanctions, but they have to be broad and they have to be actually enforced, right? So I think the sanctions we put on the Russians at the very beginning of the Ukraine war, when NATO and the EU came together, actually had some serious impact. The problem was they didn't hold. They found some loopholes, obviously, with the Chinese being one of the big contributors there, and they've gradually started to leak after that. So the sanctions that we're trying to put on these companies, I totally agree with Malcolm. These are not doing anything other than making us feel good.
all right. Well, speaking about feels, because that's about as good as it gets when we start thinking about Chinese politics and what's happening on the inside of China. But it is kind of interesting, right? So let's turn to Chinese politics in space. Ma Xingri was just expelled from the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo and the Chinese Communist Party, right? That was about 2 weeks ago on July 14th. Ma is 66 years old. He is the former head of the China National Space Administration, and he has more than 2 decades of space experience and a lot of accomplishments. He should be remembered for being the chief commander of the Chang'e 3 mission, which was China's first lunar soft landing and rover mission, right? This is not a small thing. He is essentially like a space hero, really, when you think about the narrative of China and space, major space accomplishments. But he's out because he's been accused of bribery, family corruption, and essentially sex trafficking for money or power. Now, Ma's departure follows that of General Zhang Youxia in January. Now, General Zhang was the first ranked vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. That's China's top military body. That is also chaired by President Xi Jinping himself. Now, before Zhang was elevated to that position, he served in 2 roles at the same time. He was the commander in chief of China's manned space program, and he was the director of the PLA General Armaments Department. So he oversaw human spaceflight and the buying of military satellites and missiles. General Zhang is being investigated for serious violations of discipline and law, whatever that means. But neither of them have actually been formally charged. But they are number 18 and number 19 in the list of space leaders who have been unceremoniously removed. And this purge started a little more than 3 years ago in March 2023. So Xi Jinping's been kind of busy removing space people, men who have brought the nation a number of important successes. So what do you guys actually make of this?
Well, so
Brendan?
Cassie actually just put out a report a couple weeks ago on corruption in the PLA. So the space guys, maybe they were the first ones that came in a couple years ago, but Xi Jinping has been after this since he took office. He came in, he believes in his heart of hearts that the Communist Party is the way, the truth, and the light. It is the way that they get the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and returns them to the center of the world stage. And anything that threatens the party, including corruption from within, and he is going after it. I don't think. Yes, these two had a nexus to space, but they also had a nexus to a lot of other things. One of which is money. Um, the PLA has had huge corruption issues for a long time. And I was just, I said earlier, they asked Bonnie and Clyde, why do you rob banks? And the answer was, well, because that's where the money is. Well, the money in a modern military is in logistics and corruption and equipment development, right? And so anybody that has that, that's where a lot of the PLARF generals actually had. It wasn't really necessarily a PLARFy thing. It was all back to these contracts and this money. And I don't think it doesn't appear, you can go and read the report and see the statistics. It doesn't appear to me that he is singling out people in the space industry. Ma Xingrai was definitely a high flyer, and obviously, maybe those allegations are true, but did something, untoward as far as the party was concerned. Zhang Youxia was really a big shock to the system, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's necessarily targeting the space infrastructure per se, as opposed to just general, hey, corruption and doing things that Xi Jinping doesn't like.
But here's
I
the
think I
thing,
think
they haven't been charged.
Yet. But hey, if you get kicked out, so here's the weird thing, right? If you're a party member in China, and I'm not talking about parking tickets or stuff like that, but if you get accused of a crime, the party gets to decide what happens to you first. So if the party says nope, we don't care about that, nothing is going to happen to you. So the fact that he got kicked out of the party now makes him vulnerable to the state and state prosecution. So that absolutely means there was something there that was enough to kick him out of the party. The state is going to, find that evidence. They're going to prosecute them. They have a 90-something% conviction rate. He is absolutely going to go down for whatever that is. Once you get kicked out of the party, especially from a center of power like that, it is bad news. You better have your bags back, kiss your wife, because you're not coming home for a long time.
I would add into that that seeing this is not just about individual generals or officials being accused of corruption. There's also an element of top-down control on the part of Xi Jinping to assert absolute domination and control across the entire Chinese system. And so corruption is a useful justification for getting rid of people that he sees as being either disloyal or potentially questioning his judgments, his personal judgments, or potentially emerging as a challenger to his authority. So Brendan's right. There's aspects of corruption there right through the system, but that's a convenient opportunity for Xi to essentially remove anyone that he sees as a challenge to his authority and put in place people that are completely loyal in that regard. And so it's also about Xi's personal authority. Xi wants to be the most paramount leader, even more so than Mao Zedong. Okay, that's what he wants when he finishes his term in office. He wants to be recognized as greater than Mao, and I think that he's doing these crackdowns on an ongoing basis to make sure that when he leaves, the people who are around him are completely loyal in every respect whatsoever.
And that they'll be teaching Xi Jinping thought for the next 2 decades or for him. I bet he'd hope for the next 2 centuries. But I do have to say, I find the thing with Ma really funky because it's kind of like their own Epstein files kind of situation, right? I mean, sex trafficking in China is also really no bueno.
Well,
Right?
so is
Or
having your
boo-how.
ambassador have, a kid that is an American citizen and having them recalled. So
There you go.
things
Yeah.
happen, right? Things
Things
happen. People are people. And just because you're a leading member of the Communist Party doesn't mean you're necessarily cleaner than the next one. And, Epstein's a perfect example of how many people would have been respectable outside of that and got swept up into that. So.
really good point. Excellent point. Okay, so uh, what do you guys make of this? China's State Administration of Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense, and it's got this acronym SASDIND, uh, but it sits above the China National Space Administration, but under the Ministry of Information and Technology. So on July 1st, which is again just, within the past 30 days or so, this powerful organization published a membership list, and it's a roster of national commercial space companies. There are 271 of them across 9 sectors like satellite development, data applications, rockets, launch. I hate to be so untrusting, but I just kind of feel that. As I said, this was going to be kind of IB because it's a feel that way. And, am I wrong? What does this really signify?
Well, I'm happy to take it, but if Malcolm wants to jump in there first, but
Brendan, you go first.
Yeah, so I would say this is it is a way for the CCP and the PRC to align all the elements of the space industry, right? So
Is that a diplomatic way of saying things?
no, I don't want to. We don't want to be overly concerned about this, but we do need to pay attention, right? So China is just organized differently, right? There's state-owned enterprises, there's the Communist Party, there's party cells within commercial entities, right? So it's just a different system. So I don't think this is the malevolent Borg coming and sucking up everything, but it absolutely is a way for the Communist Party and the leadership there. And remember that a lot of these commercial companies, and certainly the state-owned enterprises, but even on the commercial side, they want the party to succeed because they feel in general that China is generally on the right course, and that Xi Jinping, for whatever faults he has, is generally leading China to a better place, a stronger place, certainly in the world. And so this is a way for them to align private capital and commercial and academia in a way that is driving them toward scientific prowess, because that's part of a great nation, but also being able to bring all of that back to national security, right? And drive things that the PLA, Aerospace Force, and the space, and their space programs, as well as the rest of the PLA, need and want for winning and fighting modern war. So it's not only a bad thing, right? It can be multiple things can be true at once, right? It is actually commercial.
Totally.
It is trying to align it, but it does have the impacts of impacting national security throughout the entire realm of space. So
yeah, I think Brendan's nailed that quite effectively. I don't, Brendan, have anything to add to that per se, but it's an interesting development in that regard.
Speaking of, well, maybe it's not really a development, but it's more of a developing discussion that's happening here in the United States. I kind of wonder about what China feels about guardians and military human space flight, right? That's Title 10 authorities, which relate to the use of hard power to deter aggression and defend U.S. interests. And in fact, I dedicated last week's episode to it. Now, how would China likely respond to armed U.S. military personnel stationed on the moon? Is this a wise thing to do?
I read the Mitchell Institute report on this. It was fascinating reading, I have to say.
It was well written.
It was very well written. The whole idea of, I don't know, would you call them Space Marines or you wouldn't call them Stormtroopers? That would be a very bad move.
No, that's me. They're going to be guardians. That's the idea.
Guardians on the moon.
Guardians on the moon.
I think it's
armed guardians on the moon.
Yes. Title 10 means declared military capability or military operations. And so we are talking armed US Guardians on the moon or operating in space, undertaking missions in support of US interests. I think it's something that will happen at some point. I think invariably the momentum is leading in that direction. I think that probably the challenge is what do they do? Because there has to be something for them to do up there, and I think that's a longer term challenge because there has to be a threat that they have to defend against, and so that implies a Chinese presence on the moon, and that's going to take shape over the coming decade into the 2040s. Same with the US. So I think we are probably talking the 2040s here. We're not talking in the next few years. But once you get to that point, you then decide, well, what is it they're going to do? How are they going to get around? Because, Orion is not going to cut it. is they need something more substantive in terms of getting to and from the moon, or getting from low Earth orbit up to cislunar space and moving around space in an effective way. So, it begins to sound a bit more like The Expanse in that sense, sort of with more complex ships out there and more effective space transportation systems. But then, of course, it's the whole implications of how would the Chinese, as you say, how would they respond? The obvious response from the Chinese perspective is that they would have their own armed taikonauts on the lunar surface. And so at
But
that
they
point,
would have their own taikonauts on the surface anyway,
yeah,
right? And their
exactly. And
taikonauts really are RPLA
they are PLA.
anyhow.
But they can
i-
hide behind non-declaration, the fact that these are military astronauts. Supposedly, I mean, if you look at the Antarctic Treaty System, you've got probably PLA officers down in Antarctica doing scientific research. So therefore, technically, they're not violating the Antarctic Treaty System. Same gray zone could be exploited on the moon in that sense. But once you have armed personnel on the moon, that gray zone completely goes away. And you then basically confront the reality that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is null and void at that point. It's probably going to be null and void well before then, because the Russians are developing nuclear weapons-based ASAT capabilities. But let's say, for argument, by we get to the 2040s, we've got armed US Guardians on the moon, we've got armed taikonauts on the moon, there's no 1967 Outer Space Treaty, you've got armed ships operating in cislunar space. That's a completely new ballgame from where we are now. And I would imagine that you will see a real significant pickup in both US and Chinese military space capability development in the lead up to that, in the same way, for example, that US air power evolved very quickly after the end of the Second World War. You'll see something similar happen in that regard in space.
Yeah, I hate to be the Debbie Downer on this one, but and I love a good sci-fi. This one just seems a little bit far-fetched to me. So I actually know the very first Guardian in space. Mike Hopkins and I were in the same Olmsted class. So he went to Parma, Italy, when I went to Shanghai back in 2003, right? And so he literally
and
became
who had more fun?
I had a great time. So, I could argue that one. But he literally became a Guardian in space. He went up as an Air Force officer and then transferred to the space. I got to watch it online. It was awesome. And became the very first Guardian in space, right? And of course, all the first astronauts were military members for the U.S. Still a huge chunk of them still are today. But that doesn't mean that they're up there necessarily doing military things. And again, it's not going to be the Guardians that are armed. Until we get the StarTech lasers, the pew pew. It's going to be other platforms, right? It's going to be platforms. It's going to be machines, and all of that is going to take place in LEO and GEO way before it takes place on the moon. So I think Malcolm's right. The Outer Space Treaty is going to go the way of the wind, way before we have to worry about armed Guardians on the moon. Because at that point, man, we better have robots that are going to go and run over stuff. Because I'm not really sure how well bows and arrows, much less gunpowder, is going to work on the moon.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, no one's ever really explained what it is they do if you have armed astronauts. And frankly, I wouldn't want to be an astronaut on the lunar surface where my suit gets punctured by a round and I die horribly. I'd much rather let the robot do the fighting. And when you look at what the Chinese are investing in terms of humanoid robots, that's something that would potentially have application in terms of military operations on the moon. I think it's one of the justifications I've seen for it is, well, we need to protect space lanes of communication and trade. If we get to that point in the 2040s where we're bringing resources back from the moon or resources back from near-Earth asteroids to gain profit from them, then yes, maybe there's some sort of space equivalent to the East India Trade Company that we could have, privateers. But I think space Guardians armed on the moon and taikonauts armed on the moon is something that is mid-century at the earliest, and it's something that is very nebulous and uncertain at this point in time. I love the Mitchell Institute report. It was fascinating reading. It's sort of over my lunch, but I thought this is something that I may see in my lifetime. I may not. I don't know.
Well, if anyone who's watching this wants to know more, you can listen to last week's Downlink podcast where I have folks on to actually talk about it. So now I have to wonder, in your crystal balls, what's coming in the next half of the year? What is there that you think that the United States really needs to pay attention to, and who in the United States really needs to pay attention to? Because I think that also matters as well. We've got the Department of Defense and the Space Force. We've got the White House and the administration in general. And we've also got Congress that is trying to decide how much to actually hand over to the Space Force to spend, and also other parts of the DoD, such as the Naval Research Laboratory, which does a lot of work in space as well, right? So, what do we need to be thinking about here for the next 6 months and paying attention to?
If I kick off in terms of from an Australian perspective, Australia is having to think now about space control as a step forward from where it's at in terms of its own space activities. Obviously, it's going to be doing that with the United States, but I think there's an opportunity there for the US, for Australia, for Japan, and others to work together on a more coherent approach to space control. There was an interesting discussion by the geostrategy group in London about orbital warfare that I took part in a few weeks back. What do we mean by it? What does that involve in terms of capabilities? I think that when we talk about space control, there's a vagueness there in terms of that concept of what it is we're actually thinking about, and Golden Dome potentially drives that forward if it happens. But I think that one of the things I would be looking for, given Chinese and Russian collaboration in space, is the US sitting down with the likes of Japan, with the likes of Australia, maybe some NATO states as well, although NATO seems to be on the nose a bit with the current administration. To how do we do space control? What's the practical aspects? If we're going to defend our critical interests in space that are so vital to our military advantage, how do we do it? And what do we need to do as a group of countries working together? So that's something that I would like to see the Trump administration actually take a lead on and actually sit down with its allies and say, we need to think about this rather than just having a vague concept of space control and what that might mean.
Brendan, what about you?
Yeah, I know. I think that's very well said and totally in line with it. I would say that I was in at the Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference here in London. The chief of the air staff has, I think there was 50 something, maybe 60 air and space chiefs that come to London and talk about these things. And I was really heartened to hear, because I spend most of my days looking at China, to hear how the allies and partners are really coming together and working these problems and actually getting down to the down and dirty, not just top line pronouncements and stuff like that. And so I think that's absolutely, we need to continue that and work on that. But I took some heart from hearing that. What we need to pay attention to on the flip side is one, remember that when the bullets aren't flying, there's a lot of money to be made in space. We think it's, I don't know, $1 trillion. The Chinese think it's 10 or 14 trillion. At that point, it's just a whole bunch of zeros. They want their chunk, right? They want part of that as well. And we need to not lose sight of that because we're not at war with China. We want to avoid going to war with China if at all possible. And there's a lot of money to be made. So we need to pay attention to what they're doing, not just through a national security lens, but through an economic competition, right? They're investing in that infrastructure. They're investing not just in technological demonstrations, which they've certainly done. We've talked about them, but, standardizing launch facilities, building more launch facilities. We didn't talk about them doing, launch from naval vessels, building, like you mentioned, the laser communication the backbone that they're going to do. Proliferated LEO. They've got two both over 10,000 planned LEO constellations in Guoang and Chenfan, right? So this is a whole lot of stuff that, and I tell people I wouldn't trade our system for theirs, but when one guy is in charge and that guy says, go do this, you've got long-term programs, plans, policies, and most importantly, funding. And so when Xi Jinping, he's up for reappointment next year, almost certainly going to stay for at least that's another 6 years. in the United States and Australia and in, the UK and in free democratic societies, budgets go up and down depending on who's in charge and what the priorities are. China doesn't have that problem. So it is a slow, steady, pardon the pun, long march that they have a plan for and they are executing against. And so they may have some bumps along that way, but 5 and 10 years from now, we should not at all be surprised that they've built through civil, military, commercial integration, as well as academia, as well as foreign academics, right, that are helping them build some of these things. And they are going to achieve this goal because they have a long-term plan. Until something exterior to that throws them off that plan, that's what they're working on. And I think that's really the heart and soul of what we need to pay attention to, as opposed to, our battles in Washington, D.C., where the budget, may be great this year. Space Force hopefully gets a whole big chunk of that. Commercial space flourished under the first Trump administration, but no telling how the next election is going to go, the end of the year, much less how the next presidential administration is going to go, much less the one after that. And Xi Jinping is going to be the man all the way through all of that, just marching toward that beating drum of how do you build China as the greatest spacefaring nation on the face of the earth. He wants to do to space what they did to shipbuilding and the Navy.
I would add to that. I mean, I know Jared Isaacman is saying we'll get to the moon by 2028. Chinese are saying by 2030. I can't help but believe that if there was a significant delay to Artemis that pushed that 2028 date back, the Chinese wouldn't be thinking, we should push forward and get there ahead, because, that would, if the Chinese got back to the moon before the Americans, that would be a huge boost to their global prestige, and they can't ignore that. So yes, they're saying, we don't have any plans to race the Americans, but I think if the Americans were significantly delayed in getting back to the moon, I bet you the Chinese would say, right, let's get there first. I don't know. What do you think, Brendan?
No, I think you're right. And I think, we've seen those dates on the American side, move a couple times just to make sure that we're trying to stay ahead of the Chinese. But, at the end of the day, it's great and it's prestige, and it absolutely, regardless if they beat the Americans or not, it's going to show that they are, the big kid on the block and on par with, if not, exceeding the Americans. But I come back to the point, it's not who plants that first flag on the moon or the next flag on the moon, because we did it first, right? But it's not who does the next one. It's who does all the hard work of laying, building the transportation, building the communication, the sensing, the navigation, the logistics, building the entire supply chain, which we haven't even touched on. And I know, people pay a lot of attention to that. Because that allows you to continue and reuse and drive that commercial things forward, not just a one-off, but to go back and do it over and over again. And that's really where you're going to start to drive both national prestige and, more importantly, national strength. And that's really what we need to pay attention to.
Brendan, Malcolm, thank you both so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having us. This was great.
My pleasure.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.